If you're an organization that's trying to manage the enterprise from a cultural level, from a change standpoint, you absolutely must have highly capable HCM systems in place and progressively minded HR and practitioners. And by progressively minded, I mean folks who see their role as more than just an administrative paper pushing position, but as being agents of change in the organization.
This is the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestle & Associates, a Newport Beach, California-based ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. The ERP OCJ seeks to share expertise, insight, experience, and research, and to create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success. And now, here's your ERP expert and host, the founder of Nestle & Associates, Dr. Jack Nestle.
Hello everyone, Jack here. Today we're going to focus on human capital management, or HCM, in the future of work. In any ERP organizational change effort, managing, developing, and training stakeholders plays a crucial role. A sound HCM program has the potential to improve competitive advantage. As shared in a previous post, organizational stakeholder group and individual diversity may exist in many forms, such as value, experience, positional, educational, gender, ethnicity, age, functional knowledge, or even motivational diversities. Different types of diversity, or a combination of diversities, can create dynamics that may impact organizational team performance. As noted by Forbes, quote, human capital management refers to a set of activities that convert traditional HR functions into opportunities that lead to increased efficiency, interest, and revenue for the organization. So let's explore this idea further. Let's explore the value of a strong HCM program and its potential impact on ERP success. All of us here at the ERP OCJ hope you find this podcast useful as we share lessons learned, discover best practices, and explore the human element components of ERP organizational change. In this episode, we will discuss HCM, stakeholders, and the future of work with Brent Skinner. Brent is a human capital management, or HCM, subject matter expert, co-founder and principal analyst at 360 Insights. Brent Skinner is also a host of the #HR Tech Chat video podcast. He is a frequent voice in the press and speaker at industry events. And Brent enjoys exploring and discussing the future of work. Joining us from New Hampshire, Brent, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Jack, for that introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here on the podcast. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. I think that this whole idea of HCM is a very valuable idea within any organization. So I can't wait to share some of this information with our listeners today. But Brent, before we get started, can you tell us more? Can you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the name's Brent Skinner and co-founder of 360 Insights, where I lead the HCM practice area as principal and director. And I've been in this space for, I think it's been going on 17 years in the coming year. And I've been in many swim lanes. Haven't been a practitioner in HR, but I've worked on the technology vendor side a couple of times, once at Ceridian around the time that they acquired Dayforce, and then later, much more recently, at Cornerstone On Demand in their thought leadership and advisory services group. And we worked very closely with pre-sales on that team, and also helping to develop the strategic communication and messaging for the organization. I've also been an analyst previously in a previous life. I've had so many previous lives. That was at another analyst firm, boutique firm based in Boston, where we looked extensively at the return on investment of HCM technology deployments, what the productivity gains, efficiencies, newfound efficiencies, what kind of money did those organizations save, these sorts of things from deploying a new modern HCM suite. And I would be remiss without mentioning also that many moons ago, I was a technology editor for Human Resource Outsourcing Today, HRO Today, which is, I would say that's where I sort of really in earnest, I started really, really immersing myself in HCM. So, and just a little bit about 360 Insights itself. We are an analyst firm, a research and consulting firm. And just as any other boutique analyst firm, or even the larger ones, we have our own sort of take or our angle on enterprise software. And we cover many areas of the enterprise, not just HCM, which is what I had at 360 Insights. But we're very keen on learning as much as we can about the decision-making process in buying enterprise software. It's changed considerably over the last, I'd say, 15 years or so. Some of this is a little bit old hat, but it's worth just mentioning. Back when it was on-premises software that lived on the computers or the servers at the company, it was very much IT driving the bus on making the decisions when it came to enterprise software, and HCM was no different. Fast forward to today, with the advent of the cloud, it really precipitated this. And today, there's so many stakeholders involved. IT still has a say, but not nearly as much as they used to. But you have chief financial officers involved. We've seen chief operations officers involved in HCM deals. We've seen employee experience councils involved in deals. You obviously have your line manager, which in my area would be the director level person in HR. And you might have the CHRO and even sometimes the CEO involved. So that's a lot of people to sort of reconcile or their conflicting priorities, if you will, right, when it comes to an understanding of what enterprise software delivers. And in the HCM space, it's particularly interesting, the types of stories you can unearth.
I bet. Well, thanks for that, Brent. We appreciate it. So today's conversation is hopefully to share with our listeners and maybe bridge the gap a bit between what is HCM and its value to the organization and what potential impact that could actually have on a ERP organizational change effort. Really looking forward to sharing some of your insight with our listeners today.
Well, I just have a few thoughts on that in general, thinking about the value of HCM to an organization. That's a really interesting one. And at 360 Insights, we like to look at it actually as HCM having two hemispheres, if you will. One is concrete and the other is abstract. The concrete HCM, that's the stuff that's very easily quantified, usually from a financial standpoint in terms of labor expenditure. Maybe you have inefficient processes in place because you have an old technology or a badly deployed, or it's going to be badly implemented technology. So you have a lot of manual work and whatnot. It's costing you more in labor expenditure than you'd like. And concrete HCM is really focused on minimizing those inefficiencies and automating processes and these sorts of things. And this is the kind of thing that has relegated HR to its sort of cost center status in the organization for a very long time. But the other side of the coin, or the other hemisphere, is abstract HCM, because HCM practices and the technology for it can actually have a profound impact on employee sentiment in the organization, the employee experience, job satisfaction, the employer culture, and ultimately the employer brand, which of course is the tip of the spear when you're going out there to attract new talent to the organization, and is certainly the glue that retains existing talent. And so folks that work in HCM, folks whose jobs intersect with HCM, it's very important for them to understand that HCM delivers these two areas of value, if you will. And it's very important to have a balanced approach to that. If you're too focused on the concrete HCM, then you're just going to keep going down that path of eliminating administration and never thinking about sort of the upside, what I like to call the long tail value of HCM, which is if you put the effort in to the abstract HCM, then you're going to see that over time, which is increase in profits and all these other sorts of nice things that organizations obviously want and that contribute to their perpetuity, if you will.
Yeah, very interesting. That's interesting. I'm looking forward to diving into that idea a little bit more, Brent. Research does suggest that stakeholder diversity in its many forms is a significant factor within an organizational team structure that needs to be addressed and accounted for. And left unmanaged, it may contribute negatively to ERP organizational change. But organizations need team diversity due to its impact on organizational performance. And organizations need to understand how to manage team diversity management and development. And therefore, each stakeholder group often consists of a large degree of diversity in terms of expectations, as I'd mentioned earlier, realities and human capital requirements needed for an ERP organization change endeavor. And so, the reason I mentioned that, Brent, is because you had mentioned culture when you were talking about HCM. And so I'd like to explore that idea in this episode on how HCM can contribute to improved decision-making, alignment, teamwork, and culture. And so I know, Brent, I'm going to challenge you here for a moment, but if you could, in one sentence, how would you define HCM for our listeners? So at the intro of the podcast, I gave a definition based on Forbes, right? But how would Brent define HCM in one sentence?
Thank you for challenging me on that. I will say that I'm going to try to keep this literally to grammatically one sentence. HCM consists of practices and technology that help an organization manage the employment of people.
So then, Brent, a follow-up to that, you talk about this really interesting idea about abstract and concrete. But in general, what value would you say does a good HCM program bring to large-scale organizational change, and why?
Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. And I'll just preface this by saying I'm sure I'm going to miss some important key points. But one thing that comes to mind right off the bat is modern technology for HCM brings with it powerful analytics that HR and also line managers who are close to the employee experience can monitor, keep track of, to help the organization manage its workforce and, I would say, optimize its diversity. And this is a very, very key point that I think is absolutely essential for folks to understand, is that, if you're an organization that's trying to manage the enterprise from a cultural level, from a change standpoint, you absolutely must have highly capable HCM systems in place and progressively minded HR and practitioners. And by progressively minded, I mean folks who see their role as more than just an administrative paper pushing position, but as being agents of change in the organization.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. Hey, Brent, I'm going to throw in a little bit of a tangent for you while I'm thinking about it, but I'm curious on this evolution. Can you tell me your thoughts on the rise of the chief people officer? A little bit off topic, but that's always been an idea, and that's a position you see more and more over the years at various organizations. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. Many, many thoughts. It's really interesting. Where do I start here? I was speaking with a coworker of mine when I was at Cornerstone, a really smart thinker, and we were having kind of a conversation around the chief people officer and, again, sort of juxtaposed with the chief human resource officer. And it was really interesting. He shared with me a link, and I wish I had it in front of me. I won't take the time to dig for it right now, but one of the research firms out there several years ago published a report. It was called the CHRO and the CHROO. CHROO stood for Chief Human Resource Operations Officer. And this is sort of backing into the Chief People Officer idea. I think many years ago, organizations started, I would say on the leading edge, organizations were starting to understand, well, there's two roles. Again, the abstract and concrete HCM, if you want to think about it that way, or if you want to think about efficiency and empathy, you want to think about tactical and strategic, or soft and hard HR, however you want to think about it. Right. The idea is that part of the job is that administrative side of things. And then part of it is that cultural, that employer brand side of things. And I think that one point, the just industry sort of realized maybe we need a chief people officer as well, instead of just a chief HR officer. I think that's really interesting. I will tell you that there are some organizations that just have a chief people officer, and that person leads HR, as well as macro organization-wide cultural efforts, betterment, whatever you want to call it. Sure. And I want to throw something else out there just to spice this up even more. I know of at least one organization, and folks go to our website. I actually have an episode of the podcast about this. There's an organization that I know of that actually aligns marketing, and we put it this way, their chief marketing officer and chief people officer work hand in hand very closely on a daily basis. always aligning the employer culture and employer brand with the customer brand, the customer experience and the employee experience. And I think that's very interesting. And I think a lot of more organizations are going to do that. And I think the organizations that will find that easiest to do, I think, are the folks that have technically a chief people officer in place, or they have a CHRO, chief human resource officer, that's very much chief people officer minded. Those are a few of my thoughts on that subject.
Well, thanks, Brent. That's very interesting, especially this idea of aligning the chief marketing officer with the chief people officer. And, again, the idea of bridging the gap between what your customers want and therefore building the proper internal culture to support, that mission, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did I summarize that correctly? It's a very powerful idea in my view.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. And yeah, I'd say that's a good summarization. And I would just add quickly here that it makes a lot of sense to do that. I can't think of any at the moment, but I'm absolutely positive that there's some business models where that might not be the way to go. But I would say a lot of organizations, a lot of business models, a lot of industries, it makes a lot of sense to align the employer brand with a customer brand, the external. Yeah. Because if you think about it, your brand, whatever it is the tip of the spear, and your potential new hires of the future, right? Their first experience with you as a brand might be via the customer brand. Even if they're not in the market for what it is that you offer as an organization, they might stumble across it at some point. And I like to say, recruiters are sort of the tip of the spear when it comes to your employer brand. And why not have their understanding of the brand aligned with the customer brand? I don't even know if aligned is the right word. Maybe it's just making them one and the same.
Yeah, interesting idea. I think that's something that we could dig into. But Brent, this next question is really a team decision-making question that can sometimes be a significant challenge for organizations. And ERP software selection plays a crucial role in ERP success. I mean, selecting the right software in terms of functions and features and how it models your business is absolutely fundamental to ERP success. But you share on your website, and I just want to share a quick quote. And obviously, this is in the context of HCM. But you share that, quote, "The buy-in cycle for enterprise software and technology should not be a power struggle between departments. 360 Insights is a research firm providing deep understanding of how to bridge the gap in perception and priorities between stakeholders. Through our research, we unearth strategic approaches for streamlining the decision-making process, successfully managing solutions, and maximizing value from business software and technology investments," end quote. Can you maybe share, just even from a high level, some of your strategy with our listeners in accomplishing that goal?
Yeah. So just to clarify, we are a research organization and a consultancy, but in my role, what I am doing with my team on a regular basis is speak to end users. And so this is probably a good point to just mention a type of a report that we publish that's absolutely inextricably linked to this conversation. It's called An Anatomy of a Decision. And in that report, we look specifically at the decision-making process that was involved in choosing vendor X over vendors Y and Z. So what were the pain points? What was the possibly eureka moment or more of a cumulative thing where the organization realized they needed to make a change? How did they go about sourcing the short list of vendors that they looked at? Why did they choose vendor X over Y and Z? And then, how did that decision-making process go? Who were the people involved? And how did that internal champion, that point of contact, the person typically who ran the implementation after the vendor was selected, how did that person reconcile all those, I would say, competing priorities? And I will say that in our reports, we look to unearth success. How did these organizations navigate these decision-making, these labyrinthine decision-making processes, if you will, right? And we hope that our research is able to unearth maybe some best practices or to help folks who are about to make that decision maybe see how someone else did it. I would say that one of the best practices is that there be one point person who's involved in that process. Otherwise, if you have too many cooks in the kitchen, you may have you may have many cooks in the kitchen. Let's put it that way, right? But if you have more than one head chef, then you might be in trouble, right? So you need to have sort of somebody who's sort of coordinating it, the hub person. I would say also, if you're a vendor, let's say you're on the vendor side and you're navigating this from the sales side of things, do not expect to have direct access to the ultimate decision maker. That almost never happens. When I was at Cornerstone working and supporting pre-sales, we would help those organizations. We would help the salesperson's prospect understand the type of ROI that they were probably going to achieve by making the right decision and choosing Cornerstone in their learning systems, for instance, right? And then what we would do is we would develop a presentation, a slide deck, and we would give it to that point person who would then take that and present it themselves to say maybe it's their CFO or their CEO or whoever the person, large organization, maybe a senior vice president or someone like that, who was ultimately responsible for making the decision to say yes or no, to choose Cornerstone over someone else. And so I would say if you're on the vendor side of this, do not expect to have direct access to that ultimate decision maker. You're going to be equipping an internal champion who is then going to make the case themselves for you.
Yeah.
And if you're on the user side, I would say if it's a small organization, I would vie for as much decision-making power as possible in the process and expect it. And if I were in a large organization, I would vie for as much decision-making power as possible, but not necessarily expect as much, right? There's I could go on this one, but just to land the plane here on this particular question, I don't know if we have unearthed any sort of hard best practices, common denominators that really work in every situation. I think it's more of telling these stories and making them available for people to download and read the reports and understand how other people are doing things in this much more complicated environment and drawing inspiration from those experiences to make their own experience better.
Yeah. Yeah, great insight. And Brent, I would like to just follow up on that question, on this previous question, just a little bit by sharing a post that you have on your website. And we'll put this link in our show notes as well. But the article or the post was titled, "Is Technology Vendor Selection Really Just About Technology Vendor Selection?" In that, again, I'd like to share a quote. The article mentions, as can be imagined, our discussion meandered smack dab into 360 Insight's own core focus, understanding the evolving decision-making process in enterprise software. For one, it's important for buying organizations to advocate for themselves. When it comes to their needs, it's a little bit risky to completely rely on the vendor from sales to implementation. I'm going to repeat that. It's a little bit risky to completely rely on the vendor from sales to implementation, Brian said. This is the gentleman, I believe he's from
Anavrio.
Yes. And again, this article will be in our show notes. And then it concludes by saying, ideally, you have some way of owning that as a client and seeing it through as a client. And again, we're just diving just a little bit deeper, and you got into this idea in your response to the previous question. But can you tell our listeners more? Can you elaborate on this idea of owning the process and really how it can be a bit risky to rely on the vendor from the sales to the implementation?
Yeah. So that was an episode of our podcast, HR Tech Chat, where I spoke with the co-managing partners of Anavrio, Brenda Laughlin and Brian Turk, who I know very well. Brenda and Brian both work with end users to help them understand what their HCM processes should look like and what they should do moving forward to make them better. And sometimes that involves new technology. So I think that the gist of what you're looking at there and what you mentioned, what you quoted from that particular podcast notes, I'm going to scope out a little bit here. It's this idea that a user, a buyer, might think that they need a new technology. And they may very well, and that may very well be the case, but at the same time, it might not be. And even if it were the case, it's absolutely essential to do the due diligence to understand how their processes are, what are their workflows, and again, specifically in HCM regarding this particular podcast that you were referring to. But understanding what the workflows are and making sure that those are as efficient and pertinent as possible. And then maybe figuring out whether the existing technology in place might have been implemented wrong. might just need to be re-implemented so that it can be used properly. And then sometimes making the decision then to go out to a new vendor to rip out whatever is in place and implement and deploy something brand new. So the idea here is that you wouldn't get any of that insight if you just made the snap decision at an early point in the process to, well, we need a new technology for our HCM processes because what we have isn't working, thinking that, and then going out there to a vendor and then sort of relying on that vendor from sales through implementation. You could end up with something that's very misaligned to what your needs actually are.
Yeah,
and I think that applies to not just HCM, but any area of the enterprise, right?
Absolutely. Brent, you guys had some good articles with some great points, and I absolutely would like to share some of those out with our listeners today. But as you know, as an organization, and I would say especially in the context of large-scale ERP organizational change, the definition and alignment of success plays a crucial role, not only within the organization and within the context of ERP, but also at the individual level. And I think it's important that, as leaders of an organization, that we understand that idea. And on your website, you have an article called The Changing Definition of Success. And this was posted by Jennifer Dole. Yeah. And the article shares that, quote, "We all have different ideas of what success looks like, whether it be achieving goals, making a difference, being happy and fulfilled. In the past, success was often defined by things like job title, salary, and level of education. And while those things are still important to many people, they are no longer the only things that matter. Nowadays, more and more people are focused on making a difference and being happy and fulfilled," end quote. Do you have any thoughts, Brent, or can you share what does that mean to organizational success, and what can organizations actually do to tactically consider that idea?
I think And by the way, that post was written by my colleague, Jennifer Dole, who's principal and director and principal analyst covering talent management within the HCM practice here. She's a former colleague of mine from Cornerstone as well. I think the gist, if I were to whittle it down to maybe a soundbite here, let me see if I can roll a soundbite off the cuff here. Organizations cannot expect to succeed today without making sure their employees succeed. That might be that might capture the gist of this idea. And so let me dig deeper now. This is all mixed up with the Great Resignation, which I'm sure you've heard of. It's become a little bit of a tired trope at this point, but the pandemic, the worldwide pandemic, it really precipitated and fast forwarded a number of trends that were already set in motion, but moving much more slowly ahead of it. And one of those, the big one was in the HCM space anyway, was the employee experience, how important it was. We had ahead of the pandemic, you'd be hard pressed to find any organization that would say outright explicitly that the employee experience doesn't matter, right? But at the same time, it was more of a paying lip service as opposed to really investing in it to ensure that the employee experience was as optimized as possible to maximize retention and attraction of new talent. The pandemic happens, and all of a sudden, the employee experience is absolutely fundamental to productivity. It's really funny how a disruption of that magnitude laid bare this basic truth. And so, in part of it was the urgency and the massive disruption all of a sudden made the employee experience absolutely essential to organizational success. You had businesses everywhere scrambling to put something together in terms of processes and also technology to support that employee experience as much as possible. So that's really interesting that the employee experience all of a sudden took on so much importance with attendant with the massive disruption of the pandemic. This is tied in with the changing definition of success. So you have folks now who are kind of from the employee side, right, thinking, okay, we had a chance over about an 18 to 24 month period to really kind of reassess our goals in life. As I say, I use the royal hour, if you will, right?
Right.
And a lot of folks decided, hey, it's not necessarily what Jen was saying. It's not necessarily position or title or moving up the corporate ladder. It still is for some people, but not for everyone. But you have a lot of very, very talented people who have these changing, sort of this evolving understanding of what success is for them. As a business in today, you still need these people. And I think that's the point, is you can't expect them to, you have to adapt as an organization to the facts on the ground, the reality out there, the macro culture, if you will, right? If you don't adapt your employer culture to the macro culture, then people are just going to leave your organization. And many people might say that, hey, we have this looming, potential economic slowdown and all this kind of stuff. And this is all happy, feel good talk. And once jobs become scarce or scarcer than less abundant, let's put it that way, that none of this stuff is going to matter. It's going to go back to the bad old ways. And you might even have some, people, rubbing their hands slightly maniacally waiting for that. but at the same time, I don't think so, because you have too many other trends at play as well. You have global mobility. Just look at the employer of record market. These are organizations that help companies that are quickly expanding into new international locales. You need an employer of record to help you stand up a legal entity capable of employing those people right away. But people are starting to use, organizations are starting to use employers of record just to find the best talent. It's not necessarily that you need to expand your operations into new geography, but you need to hire as a W-2 employee somebody who lives in an entirely different region of the world. Yeah. And you have that capability today. On the employee side, they have that flexibility to move around. And so I just don't see the economic slowdown necessarily affecting this. I think organizations still, at the end of the day, will need to adapt more than they have in the past to employee sentiment and employer the macro culture to ensure their own success.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great insight, Brent. I really like that. And, I think that this idea of how, as individual stakeholders, we define success has everything to do with motivation, right? And motivation is critical in a large scale change of any kind, let alone ERP. There's knowledge factors, that stakeholders may or may not have for any specific task or project. And then there's organizational obstacles, right? In terms of the way in which culture is positively or negatively influenced. And then there's motivational factors due to a variety of different things, I would say. But the definition of success and how your stakeholders perceive success, I think just understanding that is very important for any leadership team.
Yeah.
Brent, I want to ask you about another podcast that you had on HR Tech Chat. And this particular podcast was with Ability Map CEO and co-founder Mike Erlin and Mike Bollinger, the vice president, I believe, of strategic initiatives at Cornerstone On Demand. And I thought it was a nice conversation you had with them titled Informing Artificial Intelligence. And I'm going to quote you. I believe it was you. I apologize. I'll make sure this is correct in our show notes. And in the podcast, quote, "After all, most of us would like to think that the behavior of AI as it grows eventually to an exceptionally high level of sophistication and begins to take over higher level decision making will continue to reflect what we hold dear as quote unquote humanness." So what do you think will be the role of AI, and not only in HCM, but just in general? What role will AI play on the future of work? And that's something you could talk about for an hour or two. But just what are your general thoughts on that whole idea?
Yeah. No, thanks for reining me in and keeping me honest here, because AI is one of my favorite topics, and it can go on forever. In terms of a conversation, that was a great conversation with Mike Erlin and Mike Bollinger on that podcast, and I don't recall whether it was I was the one who said that or one of the two Mikes, but it was the conclusion that we drew, and this is the idea that just to close the loop on that, that for AI to be as representative of human sentiment as possible, for it to be as fair as possible or responsible as possible, I think would be the best way of putting it. It needs to reflect as wide of a spectrum of human sentiment as possible. And that means that human sentiment that you might like, that I might not like, and the other way around. And that's what is entailed. That's what's required. And that's a really interesting episode that I encourage anyone to give a listen to. But in terms of HCM and specifically, it is just impossible to talk about HCM today without AI entering the conversation at some point. You think about scheduling software. There's highly sophisticated machine learning that some organizations refer to as AI. That's another conversation, by the way, a tangent. Is machine learning, artificial intelligence, all this kind of stuff, and maybe eventually it will be. But in any event, you have highly sophisticated machine learning that's figuring out how to put together the best schedules possible, not only for an organization's, let's say like a 7-Eleven, for its, to match store traffic, but also to optimize their employees' work-life balance, right? So that they can retain those folks, because transactional skill jobs, that's a tough market to retain employees right now. Not a week goes by where I hear about some restaurant or other that's closed down during a certain time because they don't have the staff of it. But then you look at AI also. So that's one area. But AI also helps to extend the serviceable life of an old clunky applicant tracking system, for instance, right? There's a lot of older ATS for short. There's a lot of old ATSs out there that organizations implemented many, many years ago and are reluctant to rip out and replace with something new because there's a lot of information there that's available in case they get audited on their hiring practices. So they're very reluctant to get rid of it. But at the same time, it's making life day-to-day work life a living hell for the recruiters. So there's AI, there's artificial intelligence out there that sort of it's almost like artificial intelligence middleware, where it makes those ATSs more than livable for those organizations. So those are just two examples of where AI plays a huge role, emerging, rapidly expanding role in HCM. So it's impossible to talk about the future of work without speaking about artificial intelligence. I think it's going to be absolutely intertwined with it. And so just to kind of make a full circle here, that's why it's so important right now to inform AI with as wide and broad a spectrum of human sentiment as possible so that it can appear as fair as possible to as many people as possible.
Absolutely. And I agree. Certainly a topic. We could probably have a separate podcast just on that idea.
I'd love to.
No doubt about it. And it's a fascinating topic for sure. Brent, I do want to share, and I have a couple more articles that I'd like to share with our listeners from your website. And one of those is called Whole Brain HCM, Knocking Down Software Silos and Solving for Industries. And in there, you mentioned that, quote, there's a domain of C-suites fixated on orderliness, efficiencies, productivity, and mathematical measurement. And then there's a domain galvanized by people, creativity, inspiration, and emotionality. The first is the C-suite's left brain. The other is its right brain. For organizational success, the economics of our day demand all of these preoccupations. And then the article goes on to say, just 2 years ago, Accenture decided to give this idea a name, whole brain leadership, and these companies perform better financially. Can you tell us more about this idea in the context of HCM and positive organizational change?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics. And yes, it's now over 3 years ago, I think, that Accenture came out with the idea of whole brain leadership. But it was really interesting because myself sort of establishing this idea at 360 Insights around the idea of abstract HCM and concrete HCM, it was very illuminating and intriguing for me to learn later that Accenture had come up with this idea of whole brain leadership, because there is a common thread here. When you want to talk about, talking about the C-suite, right? Again, you have the left-brained people and the right-brained people in the C-suite. I even learned that left brain and right brain is actually a theory that's been a little bit discounted, apparently, in brain science, but it's still useful in terms of explaining things. You have the more concrete, mathematically inclined. You have the more abstract people, creative. creatively inclined. And then you have sort of the CEO whose job is to synthesize those two camps' ideas into something that resembles a good direction for the organization, right? Well, if you think about it from just the standpoint of HR or HCM, sometimes I use the terms HCM and HR interchangeably, even though technically they're not. But if you think about the silos of HCM, right, there are very concrete, left-brained activities involved, and then there are very right-brained, creative, abstract activities involved. And when we think about HCM as being divided into sort of the traditional silos, especially in talent management, performance management, succession planning, compensation management, and then talent acquisition, we think about it as recruiting and then onboarding, all of these discrete, separate processes. I think it tends to further calcify, let's put it that way, this thinking of the more concrete side of HCM. So if we think about knocking down the silos in HCM and realizing that, talent acquisition all the way through performance management and learning it all blends and it all takes place sort of as a dance as opposed to a linear progression of things, then we can start to break free of the concreteness of being relegated just to concreteness in HCM, and we can start to think about how it interrelates and how it affects the employee's sentiment, their experience, and their willingness to stay with the organization. So that's really what I was getting at there. And if you want to go back to the leadership piece of that, right, HR department needs to take on a whole brain leadership approach to HCM, and that really is organizational, right? Because when you're talking about performance reviews or these sorts of things, those are line managers doing those. If you're approaching this stuff from a very linear sort of siloed perspective, then maybe you're doing just an annual performance review. Everybody hates the process, and nothing really comes of it much good, right? But if you think about it more as an integrated thing where it involves conversations, a regular cadence of conversations as opposed to assessments over the course of a year, then it's pretty difficult to do that in a vacuum. You're talking about goals, you're talking about learning, you're talking about your employees' career aspirations on a regular basis. And so already you're talking about succession planning, compensation management, and all these other things in the same breath. And so that's what's going on there when you're looking at it, when you're approaching HCM as a whole HCM as opposed to siloed.
Yeah, great explanation, Brent. And really the key is, I would say, is bridging that gap between that which is more concrete and more visible. So maybe that's, in terms of productivity and mathematical measurement versus that which is more abstract, maybe a little hard to recognize, which is, people's creativity, inspiration, and emotional well-being, I would say.
If I may add there super quickly, it's really interesting because I like to put it this way. You can't really capture that stuff in a conventional accounting spreadsheet, right? Because it needs to be an actual number, right? But I like to say this. Try to argue against employee satisfaction, creativity, their ability to think about something other than a rote process. Try to argue that that's not good for the organization. The reason it doesn't translate to an accounting spreadsheet is because we don't know the exact number it's going to be, but it's pretty much a given that there's going to be an uptick in revenue, an uptick in profitability, and an uptick in retention of top talent, all these sorts of things, which in the end are important.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Brent, I would argue that based on some pretty sound research, that those companies that rate high in those areas, and there's certainly different ways to measure these ideas of this more abstract things, right? Values and teamwork and vision and those ideas. You can certainly take those ideas which are abstract and make them more concrete so that you can have productive conversations. One of the tools we use is the Denison model. And that's basically an organizational culture survey that helps you, take the temperature of the culture on some of these ideas, some of these abstract notions, I would say. But absolutely, there is a correlation between high performing organizations and how well they perceive some of these abstract ideas in terms of the ability to be creative, the ability to be innovative, the ability to be inspirational. So it's a pretty crucial idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I could remember the name of it exactly, but Great Place to Work, which was acquired by UKG, I believe about a year and a half ago now. They came up with a measurement that actually it's the innovation something. I don't have time to look for it at the moment, so I'm mangling what it is. But it's this idea. It's this idea that organizations where more people feel like they're heard and that they're not mired by administrative paperwork or red tape and these sorts of things, all these sorts of things that are reflective of old ways of thinking and old processes, those organizations experience more innovation. And of course, innovation is the origins of competitive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Brent, I'd like to conclude on the next couple of questions here are in regards to another article. So we already talked about the article that you posted called Informing Artificial Intelligence, and that was posted in November of 2021. In June of 2021, you had another very interesting article, and it's titled Psychometric Models, AI, Talent Acquisition, Urgency, the Food Chain, and the Future of Work. And it's a two-part question here for you related to this article, but you discuss psychometric models. Can you explain what that is and how organizations benefit from and maybe how they evolved?
Yeah,
and then I'll ask you my follow-up.
Yeah, and we're talking about industrial psychology and personality assessments and these sorts of things. And these aren't the MBTI and Myers-Briggs anymore. The Myers-Briggs, it's outdated. There's a lot of stuff out there and understanding that's much more nuanced and better and more accurate in terms of reading potential employees and existing employees, frankly, personalities and where they might do best in their work, in their careers, and these sorts of things. So that's my understanding that it's a much more sophisticated science today than it used to be.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm going to share another quote. And this ties back to our artificial intelligence conversation earlier as well. But may I add that our relationship to automation is colored by our understanding that we are at the top of the food chain and our understanding and belief that robots will always be beneath us. Question. By robots, I mean artificial intelligence. We want the robots to do what we don't want to do. We never consider the possibility that AI would eventually rather not do the stuff either. It doesn't occur to us that the AI may one day wish to replace us at doing the jobs we like to do. And when and if they do, how would their doing it not be automation?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of speaks for itself. But I'm so glad that that you noticed that particular article because I really enjoyed writing that one. We're a human-centric world, right?
Yeah.
And we're developing technology with the implicit postulate in our head that it's to serve us, right? And I think the idea that it might develop to the point where it no longer serves us, but perhaps itself. is something that we really need to think about. If you have technology that's, well, there's a couple things going on here. So one of the things is just, what do we think of when we think automation? We think of, administrative processes that we don't want to do, administrative work that we want to just make easier. We want to just give the computers that job, right? That is automation, what has been up to this point. But I think that that doesn't necessarily have to be the full scope of the definition of automation. I think automation can eventually encompass any process or activity that can be computerized, if you will, or seeded to technology. And so if you look at it that way, then all of a sudden automation becomes this all-encompassing thing. And it's not just about things that we don't want to do anymore, but it's about anything that we could potentially do.
Yeah, exactly. So interesting. Well, Brent, thank you so much for your time today. Boy, this conversation flew and it was so fun. And I know it was a mixed bag. We've talked about some really fun ideas and topics. But if you were to leave our listeners with a golden nugget in terms of a piece of advice for ERP organizational change, what would you say? So looking at your experience and skill set in HCM and future of work, what would you leave with our listeners as a little nugget of advice?
Well, from what I understand, a lot of enterprise transformation projects arrive at HCM last. Not all the time, but a lot of them. And I would just encourage leaders and listeners of the podcast, anyone involved in this sort of thing, to consider starting with HCM. Get your people processes, your HR transformation done first. And then that just might make a lot of the rest of the organizational change that much easier too, because you have your people aligned to your culture.
Yeah, good advice. Well, Brent, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Can you tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, sure. Our website is 360insights.com, and that's the number 3 and 60 written out, insights, 360insights.com, and you can contact us from there. We're always interested in hearing from folks and their user experience, whether it's in using a technology or in just making the decision to select this technology or that. And you'll see on our website in the menu an area to tell us your story, to leave your contact information, and we'll be in touch. My email address is bskinner, B as in boy, Skinner with 2 N's, at 360insights.com, bskinner at 360insights.com. And Jack, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And thank you. We really appreciate your time and your insight and your expertise. So thank you for sharing. Be well, and we'll talk soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the ERP OCJ podcast.